Hello there, welcome to a new set of videos, this time on using PixInsight. My name is Chris Woodhouse and I'm the author of several books on astrophotography, and following my series of videos on Sequence Generator Pro and with the lockdown that's generally affecting the rest of the world, I thought I'd sit down and do a number of videos explaining how to use PixInsight. So why PixInsight? There are loads of different ways of processing images, and PixInsight is perhaps not the easiest program to use, and it's not free, and so a lot of people do question why I use it. So yes, there are plenty of other programs. There are several free utilities like Deep Sky Stacker, which works in Windows. PixInsight works on all platforms including Linux, Windows and Mac, which is what I have here. And there are other things like ASTAP, which have parts of the imaging processing capabilities. And there are a couple of big packages like MaximDL that have some processing capabilities along with their data acquisition tools. And I guess the last one is Nebulosity. So Nebulosity is an entry-level acquisition program, and it also has some entry-level processing, calibration and simple global manipulations as well. So PixInsight, the price is not unreasonable. It's about the price of a decent narrowband filter, and in the scheme of things it's a bargain. Now there are a couple of threads around claiming that some programs are better than others, especially when it comes to image calibration, and we'll get on to that in a little while, but more or less they do the same job, and most of the differences that people claim is just simply due to different settings that they're using. And some programs have perhaps got better initial default settings than others, but at the end of the day they're all capable of doing very similar jobs. But the reason I've chosen PixInsight is because it's very complete and it's continually expanding. It's not written by one author, it has several authors, and also users contribute. And they can contribute complete tools, or they can contribute scripts that will run the existing tools in an intelligent way to save time or do things in a very complex method very simply. So in this first video I'm just going to show us around the different things and a couple of reasons why I particularly like it. And the first thing I want to introduce you to is the concept of workspaces. So if you're using a linear style program like Photoshop, Photoshop cannot cope with some of the things that astrophotography demand, including high bit depth and also very subtle manipulations in regard to things like deconvolution and calibration and registration. So you can struggle with Photoshop, and each step may seem simple, but when you actually look back and see the number of steps you had to do, it's amazing how many steps you had to do. Similarly with Affinity Photo, personally I think it's more capable than Photoshop for astrophotography, but even then, even though it's a bargain price, there are limits to what it can do, and in all cases PixInsight will do ultimately a better job. It has a bit of a learning curve, let's make no bones about it. It's written by some very clever people and they like to put some very clever names around things, which can be a bit off-putting. But once you got over that, it's actually quite intuitive, and there are ways to make it more intuitive and to build on your experience in an intelligent way and not have to relearn everything. So for instance, I'm going to show you about workspaces. So workspaces are separate screens where each screen can have a set of objects in, which might be images, process icons and stages of what you're doing. So for instance, I often have one on stars, one on nebula and one on general. And you can also have, for instance, have one on calibration as well. Now the benefit of using workspaces is that it gives you a way of organizing your mind and your workflow. So for instance, on this screen I could have all the images concerned with ordinary red, green, blue for instance processing star color accurately, and on another workspace which I just click on, it would be all the stuff about narrowband nebula and getting the colors right. And then there might be a third one where I pull them in all together. So it allows you to organize your thought process and to stop the desktop becoming too cluttered. So I'm just going to click on this one here, which is one I prepared earlier. And this is a recent image processing on a color camera. So unlike the narrowband or the separate red, green, blue filters, I've had a color image and I've developed it to create this image of the Heart and Soul Nebula. And there's a couple of things I just want to show you which explain why I think PixInsight is worth the effort of learning. So for instance, these blocks down here are all the images. So these might be things to do with a particular stack. So if I click on that, you can see a stack. And that's one of the narrowband channels. Or it might be a mask, which is going to be used for selective processing. Or it could be something like something processed for star color. So this is the mask to be used for stars, and so forth. And each of these can be used either from a file or from on the screen and combined and added to and so forth. So these are all stages and interim images along your workflow. The other thing to look out for is if you click on a particular item. So let's just reduce this down for a second. Clicking this little double button here brings it to a more sensible size, which allows you to see the underlying ones. And just like little miniature windows, you can zoom it, you can shrink it, or you could actually delete it with the X. But for the moment, I'm just going to shrink them. And sometimes these things start shrinking down and they're all over the screen and it starts getting very cluttered. And there's one little thing you can do here that says arrange icons, and it pops them, all the shrunk ones, to the right hand side and keeps them out of the way. These things are process tools, and one of the beauties of putting them up here is it gives you a reminder what you need to do and in sometimes what order. So for instance, linear fit is something that matches the channels between the red, green and blue, and if I double click it, it brings up the tool with the last set of settings that I used with it. And that can be useful because if you're going to process a number of different files with a similar set of settings, that saves you having to remember what they are. And the same with things like, let's have a look, multi-scale median transform, lovely name. It basically boosts or suppresses or reduces noise for different scales of the image. In other words, fine detail, medium detail, coarse detail. And this here is doing some noise reduction. So the beautiful thing is it's remembered all the settings, but this particular tool can also be used for sharpening. So for instance, if I just drag that across to there, I will create what they call a process icon, which is a copy of this tool. And I can give it a name by hitting the N button in the corner, and I can say noise reduction. Except you can't have a space, so it needs to be an underscore. I always get caught out by that. So noise reduction can go there. Now what I can do is reset the tool with this little arrow button in the corner, and I can put in some details. So I can start sharpening at different scales. So a tiny bit of sharpening at the smallest scale, and it can increase up a little bit and increase the detail at a medium scale, which is typically where things start to get interesting. Whatever. The nice thing is that if I shrink that tool down, it goes back there. And if I bring it back up again, it's remembered those sharpening settings. Now, if I want to use this tool for different things, for sharpening and noise reduction at different scales, I can now drag it and I can call that sharpening. So now I've got two versions of the tool, one for noise reduction and one for sharpening, which you can store for later on or reuse. So for instance, if you're sharpening your red, green and blue channel separately, you can apply it 3 times by literally dragging it onto your image. A little tick mark comes up and you let go of the mouse and it'll apply it. So that's a way of learning as you go along, but not having to relearn. And the thing is, it'll forget that. If I close PixInsight down, that'll all get lost. So the beautiful thing is you can save a project. And this is the second reason why I like PixInsight. You can save a project, and what it does is it saves everything you can see, all the settings, all the steps that you've made in the image. So when you load a project, it is literally like you've never gone away from the screen. And so when I process all my images, I always save a project, and I can always go back and fiddle with an image or bring in some more data or whatever. So this is how this one on the screen has appeared. I actually loaded the project. I can open recent projects, and it's this top one, Heart and Soul Nebula. So that's how I loaded it. Now projects can get quite chunky. I think this is about 5.5 gigabytes because it's saving every state of the image, all the process tools with their settings, and all the interim images that you see on the right hand side. So while it needs a big disk drive, it means that you do not lose anything, and you can retrace your steps and you can go back over it again in a slightly different way. Because one of the key things about processing astro images is that it's a bit like the early days of satellite navigation. It keeps on sending you down the wrong path. And that's not because the tools don't work, it's simply because each image requires a very individual approach. And sometimes you just go down the wrong path and the image gets coarse, or you destroy something you didn't want to destroy, and you need to backstep and choose a different path. And the next reason why I really like this program is that you have total control of the steps that go into an image, and to retrace the steps or take those steps and apply it to a different image. And on the left hand side you'll see a number of different tabs that bring up either a list of the process icons, or the different formats that it can do, or it can be a file explorer, or the bottom one called History Explorer. Now History Explorer gives you the editing history of any image that you can see on the screen here. So if I bring in, it's called version 1, so if I scroll down to version 1, you can see that it's had an initial state, I've changed the name of it, and I've created a new profile. Not particularly interesting, so let's bring up a slightly better version. So I think it's this one. So if you hold the mouse over any of these shrunken down image icons, it shows what the image is, which is quite useful before you click it. So I'm going to bring up this one, Colour Neg. It looks like it's the same image, but it's not quite. It's in a different colour space because I forgot to change the colour profile settings on PixInsight when I changed my computer. So on History Explorer, I can bring up Colour Neg, and you can see here there's a whole bunch of steps. And the nice thing is I can go back to any step. So if I just double click here, it's taken the image back to that step. So it's lost some of its intensity. And if I go back a bit more, and go back to take the noise out, take out the luminance. So you can literally step back in time and see what the image looked like. So at a very early stage it was pretty dire, and it had horrible blobs for the stars and so forth. Now with the History Explorer I can go back to the last version by double clicking here, and there it pops. Now here comes the real treat. These icons can be applied to another image. So for instance, if I've got this image here and I just drag it over there for a second, if I drag that one, I can apply it, that particular tool and those settings, I can apply it to this image. So you can also do that, a group of them. So for instance, if you really screwed up and you went down the wrong path, but you screwed up here, but all these ones were good, you can drag all of these either to another image, or you can drag them onto the desktop. So for instance, I can drag it here and just drag it on top just make a little stack of them, and then let's just shrink that down a bit, give me some space. So if I've accidentally really messed up and I've got to repeat all my later steps but not an early one, if I took any image, let's say this one here, I can now just simply go bam, bam, and so forth, just dragging each of the process icons on top of the image, and it'll do its stuff. And I can either do it this way, or I can put them into something called a basket. So if I go under process and I look under etc., there's something called a process container. And the thing about a process container is if you have a set of processes that you wish to apply to an image in sequence, you can simply drag these processes into a process container, and then rather than having to drag every separate one to your process container, you can just drag it from this little corner triangle onto here, and it does each of them automatically in turn. So that's another good reason why PixInsight is incredibly powerful, and it's very adaptable, and while it is difficult to initially understand, it has an ability to make life a lot simpler when you come back to your second and third images. Now, for instance, along those same themes, I'm going to close this project down and open a different project, which is called calibration. So I'm going to lose everything that I did here, and it's going to load a new project. Now this is a much simpler project. It's all over here, that's why. So because I'm using a restricted screen, all my icons are at the right hand side. So what I've done here is when I'm doing my image calibration, there is a beautiful little script up here called batch processing, pre-processing, and it brings up a window and it allows you to put your biases, darks, flats and lights in, and it will calibrate an image. And it works really well with images coming from a CCD. And what it ends up with typically is a set of registered images that you can stack. The stacking process here is perhaps not an optimum and is what I would call a rough and ready one. But everything that this does, it uses the tools that occur here under the process tab. So these are all the different tools that you have at your disposal. And what a script does is it uses these tools one after the other with a nice friendly window that allows you to set up some of the parameters, and off it trundles. But with images coming from CMOS cameras, they require a slightly different method. So what I've done here is I've taken my process icons and I've created a dummy workspace that allows me, and a project I should say in a workspace, which allows me to do my integration and calibration and registration on my images without having to remember exactly what I've done. As I said before, each of these has got all the settings already for doing that process, and these are subtly different between CMOS sensors and CCDs, mostly due to amp glow, which tends to be something that has to be used with the right level of darks. You can't scale darks. And the other thing is bias subtraction. Because a lot of CMOS sensors do not behave the same way as CCDs, and they have a primitive dark subtraction built into the chip, if you remove the bias, it can sometimes cause your image to be totally black, which isn't very pretty. So all these settings are remembered, and I can pull up each one in turn, and I typically go down the order down here, and each one will have all the settings ready for me. In this particular case, it's already had the images loaded, so I can clear that, add the right files in, and away I go. So again, another handy tip for thinking about this for the long term rather than, oh dear, it's so complicated I can't use it. Here is a system where you can use things that you learned and store it and then use them again. Now, using again, we need to be a bit careful about, because it shouldn't be totally prescriptive. Yes, calibration typically is prescriptive, but when it gets into image processing, remember that for an image to really sing, you typically have to alter the settings each time round. And it all depends on what's in the image. Things with lots of stars in are treated differently to narrowband nebula, which are treated differently again to galaxies or globular clusters or whatever. So it requires a bit of feely, touchy stuff where you think about what you're doing and you don't just bludgeon through with a set of tools because it worked last time. But with the things I've mentioned here, you get an idea of why PixInsight is often the program of choice for a lot of individuals who have been doing it a while. So I'm just going to pause there for a minute, and I'm going to bring up another project, and I'm going to show you a couple of other things. For the last few minutes, I'm just going to show you a couple of other features of PixInsight which are quite useful. One is the use of previews, and the other is the use of active screens so that you can see the effect of a tool. And the reason that these are done is simply because some of these tools are incredibly mathematical or statistical or both, and they can take a while. This is a fast computer, but it can still take a couple of minutes to process an image with one tool. And sometimes it's easier just to try something out on a small patch of the image. So for instance, I can pull up a preview window and just for instance bring up something like that, and it's called a preview 1, and I can bring up another one if I wish to and call it preview 2. And when you click on this tab here, that's the preview, and then what you can do is, for instance, if you had a curves, so it's increasing saturation or something, let's increase the saturation, you can drag it to there and the saturation's increased, and it's done almost instantaneously. Now this is a quite quick tool, but some of the others are iterative and they can trundle along and take some time. So that's a good way of trying something out on a little bit of the image very quickly. Another way of doing it, just before I leave it, there's a lovely little tool here that there's two ones here. This one here allows you to turn it on and off, flips backwards and forwards so you can see the effect. Sometimes the effects are quite subtle, and this one just resets it back to standard. So when you do that, this one goes grey and it doesn't work anymore. There's another thing you can do which is shown on this tool, and that's this little hollow circle. And when you click that, it brings up a real-time preview, which looks to be quite a large one. So I'm just going to reduce that down in size a bit. It's because I've used this screen. I'll just move that in a bit. There we go, that's better. The reason I'm using a small screen to try and get the video speed at a sensible rate, but if I go outside the boundaries, because all these projects were done with a full-blown 5K display, they sometimes bleed outside, so I have to use the scroll bars. Anyway, back to here. This is a real-time preview, so if I now start dragging, I can see the effect of the tool immediately. Now again, the reason it's faster is it's an approximation. It's not done with every ounce of quality, but it's good enough normally to get the setting right. Not all tools have a real-time preview, and you can see which tool is being used because this little icon here matches that one there. And then once you want to apply it, you can either drag this icon onto your image, or you can hit the square one and away it will go to the image that is live at the time. So the other thing you can do is you can change which image you're applying it to. So you could, for instance, that's not a particularly good one, so you'd be applying it to this one, and again you can see the effect of changing the contrast of the stars. So you can see the effect of the preview immediately, and then when you're done you can either just shut the preview down and click on your main image again and apply it, and away it would go, and it will now make it more saturated, or you could just simply hit the square and it will apply it. Now it'll apply it twice here, so I'm going to undo it with this little undo command here, and then just hit the square, and the one in this case with the blue at the top here, it's exactly the same. There's a couple little icons down here which allow you to zoom the image and make it a handy size, or make it the full screen, and so forth. The other thing just to note is that if you're applying a mask to an image, these icons change in colour. So for instance, I've got a mask here. I'm going to drag that mask onto here, and a little double square comes up, and immediately this goes brown, and that says that there's a mask there. The mask tools are duplicated up the top here, and for instance, if I look for where they are, in this corner here, I can click on this and it tells me what's being applied. I can also disable the mask, just remove it. I can disable it temporarily with this button, so I can turn the mask on and off. I can look at the mask so I can see what is being masked, and I can also invert the mask. So for instance, if I wanted to just go after the nebulosity, I would have it like this, and if I wanted to go and attack everything apart from the nebulosity, I would do it this way around. So the masks are useful. They also apply to the previews, and very adaptable, and sometimes makes the more complicated process tools easier to use and quicker to assimilate as to what works and what doesn't. So I'm going to leave that here, just to give you a flavour of what it does, and then I'm going to come back and we'll start with calibration, and then we're going to move on to non-linear processing after we've done a bit of linear processing. But we'll get into that detail a bit later on, so not to worry about it now. So thanks for watching, and let me have your comments if you want less or more, or something particularly bugs you, and I'll try and address it. Thanks for watching.